The US, the EU, the UK too have sanctioned Russia by targeting its central bank. So are these sanctions biting, and what happens next? Steve, hello again.
Hi, Tim.
And Kim, good to see you again as well.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having us today.
Steve, start me off here. The US and the EU, they've blocked Russia's central bank from using its emergency reserves. Now, how do they achieve that?
This is a fascinating thing to watch. I don't remember ever having seen it. Central banks hold their foreign exchange in accounts at foreign central banks and foreign commercial banks. They hold them in the form of securities denominated in foreign currencies as well. And in implementing the sanctions, governments froze those accounts in the central banks and in the commercial banks, and are preventing the sale of the securities through the custodians or the brokers that they might use. There may be some jurisdictions that are going to continue to allow the Bank of Russia to engage in transactions, making payments and selling securities. But we know that we don't know of that yet, since no one's publicly announced it. So basically, what they've done is they've banned the central banks and the other financial intermediaries in their jurisdictions from doing anything on behalf of the Bank of Russia.
Kim, what's this sanction for? What's the purpose of it? Is it working?
It does appear to be working, Tim. The purpose has been to limit the use of Russian assets abroad to finance the war against Ukraine. For example, the central bank, the Bank of Russia, accumulated more than $600 billion of foreign exchange reserves that might have been used to acquire goods and services from abroad. But as far as we know, most of those reserves are now frozen. In addition, governments abroad are threatening to seize the assets of wealthy Russians that are held abroad.
Let me just pick up on that a little bit. There's an important caveat, which is that Russia is running a fairly sizable current account surplus, primarily due to its exports of energy and other commodities. I mean, the focus has been on oil and gas, but there are other commodities that they're exporting as well, like nickel and grain. This provides resources to be spent abroad, at least in principle. So, for example, if foreign jurisdictions are going to continue importing Russian gas and oil, the payments that they make for those could be used, at least in principle, by Russia to acquire goods and services abroad. But the extent to which the governments are going to impose secondary sanctions, which would forbid exporters in those outside of Russia from selling to Russia, then the revenues that Russia's receiving for those energy sales would become unusable. So instead, the current account surplus that they have could end up being frozen and being forced to be held abroad and just sit there for a while. We'll see what happens.
It's fascinating when you begin to think this through, isn't it? Now, these sanctions, they've also targeted, let me get this right, the Russian Direct Investment Fund, which is the sovereign wealth fund for Russia. Does this have an immediate effect, or is this more symbolic at the moment?
I think it's a real effect, Tim. Start by thinking that money's fungible, so that if you could sell assets abroad to acquire goods, to acquire or import goods and services, it really doesn't matter where the assets are going to come from. So in order to ensure that the sanctions are effective, foreign governments need to target all the possible sources of funds that Russia could use to finance the war.
Earlier this year and last year as well, those commentators that were warning about what Russia might do in Ukraine were also warning that they built this war chest of currency reserves that were going to make it immune to international opinion. Does it look like this strategy is now failing?
The answer is yes. It looks like the Russian war chest strategy has failed. As an example, even Switzerland, a country that has zealously guarded its neutrality for centuries, has chosen to impose sanctions. Now, there's always the possibility that some other jurisdiction will allow Russian entities to transact in an attempt to provide a path around the sanctions. But if they were to try to do that, we'd expect foreign governments to impose secondary sanctions, at least on some of those jurisdictions.
Elvira Nabulina, the head of the Russian central bank. She doesn't have a job that many people would like at the moment, but as she sits in her office, what options does she have to stabilize the economy in Russia if it suffers? And is there any way for the Russian government to get around these sanctions, or are they pretty watertight?
I think those are two pretty separate questions. First, I definitely agree that it's an unenviable position to be in. I think that the central bank, the people running the central bank of Russia, who have done quite a good job in the last decade or so of managing the Russian financial system and the economy, are now put in a position which no one would want to be in. But that said, the Bank of Russia and the Russian government retain a number of important tools for financial stabilization, for sure. First, they have raised interest rates significantly, over 20%, in support of their exchange rate primarily. Second, they've imposed capital controls to restrict the sale of rubles and also, interestingly, to compel exporters to convert foreign currency revenue into rubles. And the third thing is that the Bank of Russia retains the ability to lend to commercial banks. We've seen some press stories about bank runs in Russia, but as is the case in every financial system with a central bank, the Bank of Russia has the ability to lend, providing the liquidity necessary for the commercial banks to meet their the demands of their depositors for withdrawals and to stem those runs. Now, that all of that said, raising interest rates as they have is clearly going to depress economic activity, which is already suffering from the impact of the sanctions. But I think the point is that the domestic financial system, at least at this point, is something that they, at least for now, will be able to protect, and that won't sort of add more fuel to the fire. But the economy itself is unlikely to do well.
And what about getting around these sanctions? Is that going to be possible?
Well, there is some effort to, we could imagine there will be an effort to get around the sanctions. But again, the willingness of governments outside Russia to coordinate the sanctions we've seen so far suggests that they'd also be willing to coordinate secondary sanctions against jurisdictions that allow transactions to take place. So at the moment, it looks like it will be difficult to get around those sanctions.
And just to emphasize the issue, the point about the secondary sanctions, we've seen a willingness to enforce secondary sanctions in the case of countries like Iran, where it is the case that governments that imposed sanctions on Iran then said if any of their either financial intermediaries or non-financial companies did business with anyone associated with that country, that they themselves would be at risk. And so, assuming that they impose a similar regime on the Russians, I think it's going to be very difficult to get around this. And we're seeing some of this already because we see that people are hesitant to do business right now, but for fear that they themselves will then come under some sort of legal pressure inside of their jurisdictions.
Yes, this is something I want to ask you about, because it's one thing to see lines on graphs going way down or way up, but these sanctions stay in place and their goal is to stop Russia doing business. What's the effect going to be on Russia's economy? What's the effect going to be on Russia's people?
Well, as Steve mentioned, raising interest rates already is going to add to the depressing effect that we're seeing from the sanctions. So the longer the sanctions stay in place, the greater the economic cost. There are numerous sectors of the Russian economy that are very much dependent on imports. In fact, even the technology sector depends on imports of relatively high-tech goods. So eventually, in the extreme, you can think of the Russian economy as moving from one in which there is trade to one of autarky. And we know from experience a country in autarky is going to have, that's being cut off from the rest of the world, is going to have lower income, lower productivity, and slower growth.
Well, we've always had the opinion that there's no real point in putting sanctions on Russia because they're not going to work. That opinion showed up in 2008, again in 2014. Well, it seems that we found sanctions that have a bite now. So, of course, the question is, could the same sort of sanctions be applied back on the ECB or the Fed or the Bank of England?
So I guess, first of all, one of the things that's made the sanctions work, at least so far, has been their global nature. The fact that there's been a coordinated and very swift move by all of the major jurisdictions of the world. And so that's something that I think is important to keep in mind. So the success of the strategy really relies on that global cooperation. Now, if the entire rest of the world were to sanction the US or the Euro area, and obviously if it was one, the other would have to sanction them as well, in the same way that we're now sanctioning Russia, it could very well have a large impact. However, the US and the Euro area economies are far more diversified than Russia's, so they can probably adapt to isolation more easily if they were cut off than Russia can. Now, more easily doesn't mean easy, but it's more easily. It doesn't mean painlessly, it just means less painfully. Now, there is one significant problem for the US, though, which is its government budget deficit. If the US were cut off from the rest of the world, it would need to find a way to finance that deficit internally or shrink it rapidly. In either case, that could be painful. Even so, however, remember that the US runs a current account deficit and has very large net liabilities to foreigners. That is, foreigners own a lot of assets inside of the US, or owed a lot by the US. The cost of isolating the US economy, in fact, would probably fall largely on foreigners, not on the US. So people could try. Maybe they could pull it off, but I'm not sure it would not be as, I think it would not be as effective as what we're seeing with Russia.
Well, this is a fast-moving story, isn't it? And it is fascinating to think through everything that's going on at the moment. But I'm sure we might be having you back on because there are so many implications of this. Thank you very much for now. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Tim.
And Kim as well.
Thank you very much, Tim.
We're going to keep following this fast-moving story, so if there's something you think we should be covering, well, let us know. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.